Hi, Dave and Tim here for the single malt review, and today we're going back to some familiar territory. We're back at Benriach in the Highlands.
It's funny how we sort of orbit the Benriach Distilling Company's distilleries. It's almost like they're quite innovative and quite good.
Yes.
By way of my opinion. Anyway, of course, not their own company anymore. Recently bought by Brown-Forman. Not that recently now either, but still to see any repercussions from
Puts them in
that.
some good company though. Glenglassaugh and a lot of the finer bourbons.
Certainly, I think nothing wrong with Brown-Forman as a company. But anyway, we won't speculate over much about that.
Yeah.
We will get into what is, I think, a really, really good example of a really, really good distillery in this Benriach 16-year-old.
Yeah, we've done a number of Benriachs before, but it's been the, I guess, more esoteric stuff. A lot of single cask releases or some unusual or obscure finishes.
Well, it's sort
We're
of
going back to the core range for once.
that's
now.
sort of the thing with Benriach. They're of any distillery, they are going to be the ones that are doing some experiment or some peated version or what have you, finishes, odd casks, odd methods of distilling. Floor maltings, goodness knows. This is, I think, the first, what you might call a straight Benriach that we've actually
I think so, yeah. From
opened.
what we think of as a core range, just an age statement whiskey, no particularly outlandish, unique selling point to it.
And I spend so much time focusing on these sort of weird, experimental things that they bring out. I just... it sort of sometimes falls by the wayside, and enjoying, well, as you can see, enjoying most of this one over the past few weeks, reminds me just how good straight, normal Benriach really is, especially when it's a good mature age like 16. So let's get into it without further ado.
Yeah.
Speyside whiskey, obviously, from the heart of Speyside, as they say. Actually, they're not far off. They are more or less dead centre in Speyside there.
That's a 43%, but not chilled or filtered or coloured.
Yes, quite there, right on the label, no colouring, no chill filtration, which is fairly typical of that company. So that's sort of extremely good to see. They're quite lucky to get away with 43% for a non-chill filter without that clouding up,
Yes,
but you get away with what you get away with, so they've saved a buck there.
That's a lovely, rich and sweet nose. Apricot marmalade, ginger, honey, jam, lots of things I'd want to spread on toast.
Yes, indeed. It is, while being typically Speyside, it's almost like a Speyside Highland hybrid for me. It's got the sort of apples and pears that Speyside has, but rather than being sort of crisp and white versions of themselves, they're really very, very sweet to me. I find there's a distinct honey character, quite a, what you'd almost call bush honey here in New Zealand, quite a distinct darker honey than your sort of clover garden variety stuff.
It might just be that they're always been quite close as companies, but there's a fair bit of overlap with a lot of Glendronach character, I find.
I
I've always
suppose.
regarded Benriach as kind of like Glendronach's slightly more outrageous, adventurous, more experimental cousin.
I'm not sure how many parallels I'd draw with the actual spirit, given that Glendronach is such a distinctive whiskey.
Yeah.
I suppose now that we have the Heelan, although we drank it all, we would finally have a point of comparison because we'd have some more middle-of-the-road normalised Glendronach with which to taste Benriach against. But I think, or at least I would assume, they'd be quite different in terms of spirit.
Benriach are a lot more willing to use bourbon casks for maturation, aren't they?
Absolutely. This one, although it doesn't say on the bottle, it'll be primarily bourbon with some sherry, the sort of standard house blend. It will be put together quite mathematically somewhere.
Smells lovely. Let's see how it tastes. That's quite mild.
It is. It's gentle, but it's very, very warm and very, very rich. And as you let it go, at its full strength like this, it's really, really quite long.
Yeah.
And what I discovered, tasting this among actually quite older whiskies that I had on the go, one of which we will try today. It may only be a 16, but this brings a great deal of nuance and subtlety and length that I think some older whiskies don't. This is... I've been having a think. A sort of crisis of identity in my malt appreciation recently. My favourite distillery was always Crag & Moore. Yours famously is the Glendronach, which is a much better bet really, because they make much more and interesting whiskey. Crag & Moore just sits there and churns out their jolly classic malts 12-year-old, which is a fine whiskey. Crag & Moore was my favourite distillery because of the astonishing but incredibly few and far between single cask releases that got bottled independently, and I think it may have just gotten too hard work for me to search for those and still call it my favourite distillery. I think when the right cask comes along, it really is. But these days, on reflection, I think Benriach is rapidly becoming my favourite distillery because of their willingness to experiment and bring out these dynamic new expressions. But also because I think this is just a stellar standard whiskey that they make.
Yeah, I called this mild on my first sip because it is very easy to drink. It's like someone's added water to it already. It's kind of exploding with a lot of really Speyside characters now. I described the nose as being more Highland, very sweet and heavy. Now though, I'm getting lashings of pears and apples, a lot of that waxy, rindy fruit skin.
It's, as you say, that the pears and apples are there. I think the way I describe them, how they're different to your sort of crisp, Speyside, lighter fruit flavours. These ones was almost like they've been stewed. It's like you've taken those fruits and you've sort of stewed them up in a pot with a bit of sugar. Not too much. Maybe even honey rather than sugar. And it's that slightly cooked, slightly half-preserved pudding version of the original fruits.
That's really interesting because I'm not getting it at all. I'm getting lots of fresh, less sweet, sort of peeled straight off the apple, chewing on a piece of apple peel flavour. But it's good that it's expressing itself in different ways to different people. You get a lot of, like, I guess at the sweeter end of the spectrum, more like what we at least would call a Danish pastry. They're lightly raisined and iced, glazed pastries. I'm not sure if it's their common term for them, but Danish, but that's what we'd call Danish at least. And yeah, a bit of that.
And that waxiness, as you say, is there, and it hides behind a lot of the butteriness, which I get as well. That's where some of the pastry, I think, comes from, sort of a buttery, flaky pastry almost. But there is an almost, not quite as distinct as Clynelish, but there is a Clynelish-y waxiness there, which really helps lengthen it out at the end and kind of frames the other flavours as it sort of sticks around on the palate.
And I remember my first impressions of Clynelish, the very first time I had it when I was still a relative newbie to whiskey, and just an immediate and lasting impression of straight up beeswax. There's a bit of that here, but a lot less of it. A few characters though, if you ever had raw comb honey, I know you've used it for brewing and whatnot, but if people watching, if you ever had straight up fresh comb honey, you get quite a bit of beeswax in there, some impurities, some roughness, but it's still very honey-like, and there's quite a bit of that in here too.
No, I wish I could espouse more of more describe the what really takes me from this whiskey. There's just something, an uncharitable way of calling it would be middle of the road, because it is a middle of the road flavour. It is very warm, Speyside-y, what you expect. But it's more than that. It's really well balanced, I think, would be probably the significantly more charitable way of describing it rather than middle of the road. It brings flavours from sort of all different aspects of what Speyside expresses as, and it brings them together, for me, really well.
It's an eminently capable Speyside. It does Speyside, it does Benriach very well. It doesn't have a particularly standout character, it doesn't have loads of this or shovel loads of that or oodles or something else. It has an all-round, well-rounded character, which is big and expressive, and it doesn't need a standout, unique selling point to make it special.
So I hope I have given it an element of profundity, because I'm scoring this one a 90 for me, even 90. What do you think?
This one rates an 87 from me. It would be higher if it had one of those outlandish standout Benriach characters, but it doesn't need that in order to be a very, very good 16-year-old all by itself. Easily recommended and easily enjoyed too.
No, solid stuff. Look out for it. Affordable too. We don't score on price, but Benriach, really across the board, Benriach is a very, very affordable whiskey. Goodness knows why, because they don't spare any expense in making it, but at least down in our territory, very, very cheap comparatively. So keep your eye out. And if you were getting one, this, I think, if you're getting standard Benriach, I would recommend the 16. There's nothing wrong with the 12, and there's nothing wrong with the 10, but for the comparatively very small price increase, I think the 16 is where it really, really starts to take off, and you get an awful lot for your money there. So that's where my recommendation would fall, if you want their house blend collector on Benriach anyway. Bit of a distillery spoonerism there, but never mind, got the right company. Anyway, Sludger, we will keep on working here and find something else for you very shortly. Sludger, said the one already, never mind.